Welcome back to the debate. Once again, we continue our conversation on the extraordinary session of the OIC Foreign Ministers meeting that is going to be hosted by Pakistan tomorrow. This, of course, is extremely important with regards to the situation in Afghanistan. And we all hope that, if nothing else, then the humanitarian aid that is required urgently by the people of Afghanistan is actually delivered to the people in the country. And the discussions that are required for this step to move forward are actually the ones that are taking place. And the country is really step up in terms of what needs to be done. To further continue our discussion in the special transmission now, we have been joined by two very important guests online. We've been joined by an Afghan affairs expert, Mr. Tariq Farhadi, and we've also been joined by fellow foreign policy program, the Brookings Institution, Ms. Madiha Afzal. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us on the debate and taking time out for this very serious matter regarding the situation of Afghanistan and, of course, the OIC's role in this regard. Mr. Tariq Farhadi, I'll start with you. This is something that we've discussed repeatedly, and we all have really high hopes in terms of the situation in Afghanistan. Pakistan has always supported peace in Afghanistan and has spoken at length about the urgency that is required in terms of helping the people there. Do you think that this urgency is being felt and will translate into the discussions that are going to be taking place in the OIC session tomorrow?
Yes, thanks for inviting me. The urgency is felt in Afghanistan, above all because we see poverty there. People, they're internally displaced with not much help coming. Stories of hospitals filled with children with malnutrition. The UN agencies declaring a state of emergency pretty much on what is happening. And about 4,000 Afghans leaving Afghanistan, especially to Iran, each day. At this point, Iran is hosting up to 10% of the population of Afghanistan. If we think that Afghanistan has a population of 35 million, Iran is hosting 3.5 million refugees. Pakistan is hosting about 2.5 million refugees. So that's also a considerable percentage. And to prevent the situation worsen, all kinds of meetings are necessary. However, on OIC, I moderate my optimism. OIC countries are divided in three categories for me. 27 countries or so in Africa, they need help themselves in terms of poverty reduction. Then you have the Gulf countries. They have a lot of money. Qatar is involved in Afghanistan. Other
President Karzai
Gulf
in
countries.
the past. Tariq Sahab, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Because you have advised former President Hamid Karzai also, and you are someone in the know. Let us first, before we talk a lot about OIC, let us establish a baseline. What are the needs of Afghanistan? Can you give us a number figures regarding what might be needed right now? What kind of money that might be needed right now?
What the needs are is $4.5 billion per year of aid in Afghanistan, which is the level that Afghanistan was receiving before the collapse of the Ghani government. So simply, $4.5 billion. Afghanistan has been receiving in the last 15 to 20 years this kind of an amount to survive. And suddenly, this $4.5 billion was reduced to almost nothing, and now the UN has collected about $1 billion, and the UN is going to distribute this money. But here also I caution that the UN cannot replace a government.
Right. Mr. Farhadi, let us also include Ms. Madiha in the discussion. Madiha, considering that this, of course, is something that we all have high expectations from the OIC meeting that's going to be held tomorrow, we all are hopeful for change in Afghanistan. But in terms of what should be done, there are many things. But realistically, what can be achieved at best from this conference tomorrow?
Yes, thanks for having me. I think the conference really literally is quite an extraordinary meeting in terms of the convening power and the guests that have been invited, not just obviously from OIC countries, but countries in Europe, the P5+1, Russia, China, the US, and there's going to be a Troika Plus meeting after that as well. So it's an extraordinary meeting to discuss Afghanistan. And I think what can be achieved is a consensus that the humanitarian crisis needs more than is currently being done. It needs extraordinary measures. So, humanitarian aid will not be enough to solve this humanitarian crisis, right? It needs more. So the problem here is that there are sanctions, of course, on the regime, on the Taliban regime, and there are $10 billion in frozen assets in the US from the Afghan central bank. And that is a decision, to unfreeze those assets, to flow, basically to get the economy to flow again, to get the banking sector to work again, to get, healthcare workers paid and teachers paid. That's what's needed. However, the US has made it explicitly clear that the conditionality on unfreezing those assets is that the Taliban make concessions on human rights and women's rights that it has not yet made. And so we are in a dilemma right now. And the ultimate, the power here lies with the US. And so while a consensus can be reached on the fact that there is a crisis, I don't think a consensus can be reached on, unfreezing those assets. That's a decision that needs to be taken in Washington. It won't be taken in Islamabad.
Dr. Madiha, my question is in two parts. Number one, if we talk about the consensus, we know that within OIC there are countries that are obviously, they do not sit with each other, they do not talk to each other, they don't have good relations with each other. And what would you say about that? That they will be, coming on the same table with a consensus? Number one. And number two, we have a sort of OIC that can come up with a statement. And should we expect a statement from OIC asking America and asking the Western world to, unfreeze the money which is already in there? $9.5 billion I'm talking about.
Sure. So on the first question, I think on the humanitarian crisis, while they may not agree with, the countries of the OIC may not agree with each other on many matters, including relationships, that they have with each other, I think on the humanitarian crisis, the world is pretty clear. And I don't think, there can be disagreement on the fact that, Afghans are slowly, as the World Food Program had said it, marching towards starvation. I don't think there is anyone who can really deny that reality.
True.
What comes out of the OIC meeting, you're right, it's probably going to be a statement. And I think it will, the fact of the matter is that the special representative of the US to Afghanistan, Mr. Thomas West, is also in Islamabad. So I believe he will also have some say in that kind of statement that comes out. I don't necessarily think we're going to see, a statement urging the US to unfreeze assets. But I think we will see a statement basically acknowledging that more needs to be done than and more needs to be done than just, the 280 million, let's say, in humanitarian aid that the World Bank just released to Afghanistan. The crisis asks for more, and to figure out ways, even if it's not, an unfreezing of assets, figure out ways to get that money that is not in the millions or in the hundreds of millions, but in the billions to Afghanistan, and to get it to the people who need it.
Right, and that's all right. Madiha, you actually brought up the matter of conditionalities, and I understand that every country, especially in the West, have these sensitivities that they are looking to. But is it not a debate of yesterday that is going to hamper tomorrow? All I hear is yesterday and tomorrow, not today. As we speak, Afghan people are suffering through this very harsh winters, and they don't have food. World Bank and other bodies have pointed out that they might need They will essentially need $700 million by the end of January. On the other side, you just heard Tariq Farhadi Saab that $4.5 billion are needed. So my question is a statement coming out of OIC going to compensate that kind of need? Madhya.
Right. I think the issue here is that the world is not moving fast enough. And one thing that we have not talked about is politics within the United States and politics in Washington, D.C. Yeah. So, the US basically, when it was withdrawing from Afghanistan, assured Congress essentially, the government, the administration, when it was withdrawing from Afghanistan, and this falls to the previous administration as well, the Trump administration, that basically, we would hold the Taliban accountable. We're not going to give the Taliban free pass to run the country, and we would hold the Taliban accountable by the tools that we have, including the tools of aid and sanctions, including the freezing of assets. And that is, what the US is doing. Now, the fact of the matter is that it's hard to talk about rights when people are starving, right? But that's where the conversation is. And it is very difficult in a very politically polarized environment here, where Republicans and Democrats want to blame each other for Afghanistan, to really just, sort of get past that kind of politics. And that is a key
And just
factor.
to qualify what you're saying, when you talk about US politics, are you merely talking about the Congress, or are you also referring to the numbers, approval numbers of Biden administration right now? And they might be a huge problem for the administration to actually dispense with any kind of care or any kind of consideration for Afghans.
I think there are really two factors here. Yes, Congress. I think the debates that have been had, the hearings that have been held after the withdrawal, in August, and that was widely, the withdrawal was widely considered to be, very, very badly done by the administration. But of course, Republicans blame Democrats and blame the Biden administration for it. The hearings have made it clear that this has become a political issue where, each party is blaming the other. The Biden administration is, of course, blaming the Trump administration for engaging in that deal in the first place. The Republicans are blaming Biden for the botched withdrawal, as they call it. So that's partly it. But, I think the poll numbers are also at play, right? So the American, Biden wants to get past the Afghanistan disaster, right? He does not want his entire first year to keep being about Afghanistan.
Right, Mr. Farhadi. Mr. Farhadi, we also know that whenever we talk about the OIC meeting and the situation going forward in Afghanistan, there is, of course, a lot of concern in terms of what the Taliban regime is expected to do. And a lot of those concerns need to be met before many of the things can go forward, including perhaps the issue of aid actually trickling down to the people in Afghanistan, because that's also dependent on a lot of things and a lot of issues that the international community may have with the regime there. With the Afghan foreign minister also participating in the OIC meeting tomorrow, do you think there's a possibility of any sort of step forward by the Taliban regime that can perhaps move the stance of the international community as it is now?
I hope so, because what I was going to say is that in tomorrow night's statement, there has to be a call for the Taliban to realize that they need to change as well. The Taliban have not changed in the past 4 months. What they have said is, we have brought casualties in Afghanistan to near zero. It's near peace in Afghanistan. We will deal with the women's issue as we like. We have an exclusive Taliban government, whether you like it or not, but we call it inclusive. And the world has to like us this way.
Right.
And Farhadi Saab, since you are talking about the conditionalities again, and I totally get it, and I kind of have been supporting them as well. My concern at this moment is that we are talking about, and I understand that I cannot out-Afghan an Afghan, but there are people actually suffering in Afghanistan, right? And we keep on talking about all these political aspects, which are serious. But the fact is that there are Afghans which are vulnerable right now in Afghanistan. If the world community comes up with any kind of financial aid or any kind of aid, what kind of mechanisms are there to ensure that it reaches the common people with or without Taliban?
Right now, the United Nations has found the mechanism of bypassing the Taliban by landing cash and directly transferring it to a personal, to a commercial bank without making it through the Afghan central bank. But as I say, in a country of 40 million people,
banks are collapsing. So even if you transfer that money, people cannot withdraw them. It has been reported since yesterday and day before yesterday.
One bank has closed down, but yeah, as long as there is a flow of money in these countries, moribund banking system will survive. But the banking system doesn't serve all the population of Afghanistan. The banking system serves the people in the cities. And poverty is really where the cold comes in, where the snow comes in, and people can't have enough logistics to get aid to them. And this is where tragedy will happen, and we will find out about it after the winter, because even the press coverage in Afghanistan is becoming more limited, with Western press, being less present. They are there, but not for long. It's a crisis situation. We need to find ways to come to a meeting of the minds between the Taliban and the international community. For now, none of these two sides have really budged.
Right. And Sana and Faisal, this kind of reminds me of Squid Game, this television series. So that whosoever survives the winters will get the relief.
Yeah.
I mean, that becomes a tragedy, right?
That is very odd. Dr. Madiha, talking about the economy of the people, especially, I think a couple of days ago or yesterday, I went through a story of Anadolu, which happens to be one of the premier news agencies. They have been reporting, and they've been saying that ISIS Khorasan is offering from $270 to $450 to attract people to join them. This is what the current situation of Afghanistan is right now. We know the facts that in past and currently as well, Western powers, they are concerned about two things. Number one, refugee crisis. Number two, terrorism that hails from Afghanistan, that hails from Syria or elsewhere. Should we not, think about this, that maybe the Western powers would consider this fact that out of desperation, of course, people might end up joining where they should not be joining, and these sort of aspects should be given a huge consideration from the Western powers?
Right. I think ISIS-K, the Islamic State Khorasan, is a huge concern. I think both for the region, it's a concern for the Taliban, it's a concern for Pakistan and the region, and it's a concern for the West. So on this, everyone agrees. I think there is consensus on the threat that ISIS-K poses to Afghanistan. Now, I think ISIS-K also is what is partly constraining the Taliban's actions. Because the Taliban is concerned that its members who are more hardline and more fundamentalist may defect to ISIS-K. It is not making concessions where it should be making concessions on human rights, on women's rights. So that also is playing a role in what the Taliban is doing. So I think that's a huge concern. And I think the world is also concerned that the Taliban is not, doesn't actually have the means right now to be able to counter ISIS-K effectively. But I think I completely agree with Mr. Foradi. I think there needs to be a statement when the statement comes out tomorrow about what the OIC countries, what this meeting expects of the Taliban, right? And of course, the fact that Tom West is there, and the fact that the P5+1 countries are also there, they will put in some expectations, just like the Troika Plus readouts do, the expectations of the Taliban. So I think it'll be important to have that clear and that posed to the Taliban while the Taliban is represented in Islamabad tomorrow.
And Sana, with your permission, very quick question for Faisal. In 2 days, the second time you brought up this story, and while you are talking about the threat posed by ISKP, you're not even asking this kind of number, the dollar number that you're giving, this kind of money. How is ISKP getting all this money, right? This is also important. Is it not a factor? Because in the age of FATF, when we are, on the grey list, I want to know who's actually giving all these terrorist organizations this kind of money.
Exactly, and we all know that there was a country that had a very deep-rooted sort of clandestine mission going on in Afghanistan, and that was India. Who knows that India is still trying to penetrate some kind of chaos in Afghanistan, so that the western border of Pakistan remains the same as it always wanted.
But my humble submission is, regardless of which country it is, follow the money.
Yeah.
You follow the money, you get the solution.
Exactly.
The most important thing that comes to mind over here, of course, is when we talk about humanitarian assistance being the topmost priority at the moment of different countries, and the various plethora of issues that we keep discussing, which of course come into play. It seems that perhaps there is a way where all of this can, at the time being, be ignored, and humanitarian assistance be considered as a topmost priority, and so another way of actually resolving this issue may be devised. Mr. Farhadi, considering all of the issues with regards to the threat in Afghanistan, the commitments by the Taliban regime, the concerns within the domestic politics of different countries, the issues of inclusivity, and all of the rest that keep coming up whenever we talk about things moving forward, irrespective of that, if we're saying that the humanitarian situation requires an urgent effort, it perhaps also means that all of these issues need to be put in the background, and then a different way of moving things forward need to be decided for the time being at the moment. Is there a simple way, a simple solution that perhaps is obvious but is not being met?
Well, what I have proposed in some interviews is for Taliban to completely depoliticize the central bank so that money can come into the central bank of Afghanistan. But in this central bank, no Taliban should be present. And the central bank can be audited weekly by the IMF, International Monetary Fund, which had an office in the central bank up to 4 months ago. And to make sure that the money that comes for aid goes for salaries and it doesn't go to the security sector. And I've also said that the Taliban can finance the security sector through border taxes that they collect. They will collect enough to finance the security sector. But the aid money needs to come through the central bank to be paid salaries. That way, the central bank can sell some of the dollars and euros in the market and keep the value of the Afghani where it was before, because in the past 5 days, the Afghani has moved up to 25% up and down. And when it moves like this, really the small guy, the mother.
Who really ensures where the money goes? Who's going to ensure that the money goes where it needs to be gone? That is a huge issue that, of course, the community at large is also looking at, where they don't really trust that the money is going to go where it needs to be.
Right, and with your permission, Sana, because, and I was crowing about this at the start of the program also, Tariq Farhadi Sahab, you have incredible amount of domain knowledge, right? So you're perhaps the first person who has actually identified this mechanism in past many days since we have been talking about it. The question right now is, when you say depoliticize the state bank or whatever bank there is, the question is who's going to appoint its head and how, who's going to define the TORs? Can you also identify that as well?
Yes, the two war can be defined by the World Bank, the IMF, and the US Treasury. And somebody who is acceptable to the Taliban but is not a Taliban, and somebody who is acceptable to the world because of experience and background can come and do this.
There
I
you
have
have a
offered this
solution.
to the Taliban. They haven't come to the conclusion to accept.
Madiha, do you think that this is a solution that perhaps can be acceptable to the Taliban regime and the international community?
I mean, I think it's certainly a creative solution to the issue, and I think it has the potential if the mechanics can be worked out. But I do think that there is almost sort of a step before that that needs to be taken in Western capitals, where they need to move beyond the idea that humanitarian aid is going to be enough. While there's a consensus being reached by analysts, by humanitarian agencies, by international agencies, I think governments are not yet quite there, right? So the government of the US is not there. The governments in the EU are not quite there yet. They have to make that step, realize that this requires more than humanitarian assistance to solve. I think if this conference can help move that realization forward, it will have been successful.
Right, and this actually saddens me when I look at the political parties that are ruling the world, various countries, particularly the US. I see a very well-meaning government which wants to actually heal a lot of wounds, but because of all this politics and all this, poll numbers, they're held back. Is there a solution there? Madiha?
I think it is, this is a very difficult time, right, for the Biden administration. Now we actually also are in the middle of a new surge in terms of coronavirus, something that he thought he would have put behind him. For him to be ending his first year in power with multiple crises, right? So if we turn attention back to Afghanistan, that will recall, I think, one of the low points, obviously, of his year, August. And that's, I think, something that the Biden administration is not necessarily eager to do. So I think it will have to be quiet sort of work on the part of the administration with Congress. And there are well-meaning, I think there are well-meaning Republican Congress men and women, Democratic men and women who can come on board and basically come out and say this. But that step has not been taken yet. I think the discussion of the humanitarian crisis in the US has not quite moved to the urgency that the world wants it to get to.
And perhaps that's not just true for the US, it's probably true for many parts of the world. And we see that even many different platforms like the OIC and other conferences that have been held since the Taliban have come into power, they've talked about this issue, and there has been continuous engagement, but we don't really see action, and the kind of urgency that is required for help in Afghanistan is not met, which of course is a big fear of the OIC meeting tomorrow as well. There is movement now, this is happening now, there is going to be a discussion, there are going to be statements, and it seems like there is something happening. But in the aftermath of this meeting, Mr. Farhadi, the kind of work and the kind of frequency and the will that is required by all of the countries participating tomorrow, do you think that exists at the moment?
Well, I think there will be a trust fund established tomorrow for Afghanistan by the OIC countries, which can be only funded by the Gulf countries because they have the wherewithal. It will be a small amount compared to the $1 billion that the EU has collected. And it will be humanitarian aid, nothing more than that. But I think my message is in this interview and in interviews I make in Kabul, because in Kabul, the press is free. We can talk to the Taliban. I was just in a debate with the Taliban in Kabul. I tell them, you have to depoliticize part of the government so that we can make things happen. There's other well-meaning Afghans that want to help Afghanistan and then want to give this peace to take hold in Afghanistan. We know that if it goes awry, it's very dangerous with ISIS and all the criminal groups. And we want this to gel in Afghanistan, but they have to open the door to well-meaning Afghans to support them.
Right. So what can be the most immediate steps that the Taliban regime can take to reassure the international community right now? What are the most immediate things they can do right now so that the international community can see at least moving way forward in terms of whatever they want to expect with the Taliban?
The signaling. Mr. Mutaki has to go one step further and say, we will change the government and we are going to do it. And when I go back to Kabul, I will talk to the other leaders. So far, they have been saying, no, we are already inclusive. What are you talking about? But everybody knows that it's a Taliban-only government. So
right.
they have to move
when,
one step forward.
Farhadi Sahab, when you talk about depoliticizing certain parts of the government, are you not actually referring to what the world expects as inclusive government and which Taliban are averse to?
By one stone, they can hit two targets. Basically, by depoliticizing parts of the government, they can bring people who are non-Taliban, and they can really claim at that point that it's an inclusive government because they're non-Taliban in it. And it will be preferable that they bring a couple of prominent women also to begin with in the government. If they can bring up to 30% non-Taliban, it's a very good start. And that issue of women's rights and inclusive government is almost dealt with for now. And the issue of terrorism in Afghanistan is not something that we can deal overnight anyways. It's very complicated.
Mr. Farhadi, as we know that you have been very close to the previous setup, of course you would know quite a few people from the previous setup who could join the Taliban if Taliban wanted. And what kind of people and who would they be who could be compatible with the Taliban if we talk about the inclusive government?
Farhadi Sahab himself could be one.
In Afghanistan for the past 18 years, I have been with the IMF,
including
the World Bank, and the Islamic Development Bank. But I follow Afghanistan. I think the people of Afghanistan don't want any of the past leaders. But they do want people who are not Taliban. They could be people who are bureaucrats, not Taliban, and not leaders of the past.
Could you name some, please?
You have one in front of you.
Madiha, I also want to talk about when we talk about the Taliban regime and the expectations of the international community. Of course, the issue of women's rights keep coming forward with specific regards to access to education for girls and women and job opportunities for them in the country. This, of course, is a major commitment that is required by the international community from the Taliban regime. When we look at the situation the world over, this is something that many parts of the world seem to be fighting towards, and there are issues that are still being raised in terms of what needs to be done about it. The expectation from a regime like the Taliban in Afghanistan, do you think that this is perhaps a far-fetched expectation and perhaps an excuse for not moving things forward, considering what is going on in the other parts of the world?
I don't think it's an excuse for not moving things forward. And I don't think any other part of the world just completely bans access to girls' education from high school onwards, right? And this is access that girls in Afghanistan, in particular in Afghanistan's urban areas, had until August. Now, the Taliban's excuse has been that the schools are not quite ready, that there's a security situation, that's a problem. Well, the security situation actually excuse was something that they used in the 96 to 2001 timeframe. It apparently never went away. In some ways, the security situation is far better right now in terms of just violence in Afghanistan has gone down. And the excuse that the infrastructure and the setup is not quite there, again, is a mistaken one and is sort of a ruse because schools already exist that are segregated. Girls' schools are separate from boys' schools. That had been the case in the previous regime. And we also know that in some areas of Afghanistan, locals have engaged with the local Taliban leaders and have actually quietly sent back their girls to school, and the Taliban has not. So we know that this is something the Taliban can do. I think, they do not want to alienate their foot soldiers who believe that girls should not go to school, and that is what they're coming back.
Right. And Madhya, since you are an academic, also a researcher, let me ask you something about system analysis. let me ask you, is there a provision, a possibility that there can be some kind of provisional recognition? It seems that we are trying to invent all the parallel systems rather than dealing with the government in Kabul. And you must have seen the reports that Afghanistan's previous representative to the UN actually stepped down, and now that chair is empty. Can't there be any conditional or temporary recognition of whatever government is there in Kabul? And whenever the Committee of Nations or the UNSC want, they can boot them out. But at this moment, they know whom to talk to.
I think the question about recognition is an important one, and I'm glad you brought that up. I think at this point, the first step should actually not be to talk about recognition. I think the first step really needs to be talking about sort of the financial sector, the unfreezing of assets, or trying to get aid to Afghans so that they don't starve. I mean, I think it should be clear to everyone that that is the first priority.
Right. But you realize that because you're talking about various things which are regarding finances, you realize that systemically that is going to pose a problem, right? If you release the funds, but there is no government in Kabul, whom are you going to release it to?
Right. I mean, so official recognition is something else, right? But I think official recognition needs and will realistically be withheld for the time being until the Taliban make sort of blanket concessions that the world wants, and that's an open question. But I think temporarily, at least, releasing funds, injecting liquidity into the system does not need to come with sort of recognition. I think there are ways to bypass the Taliban and ensure that the money doesn't basically end up enriching the Taliban. And Mr. Farrukh suggested one, and tomorrow is the forum to come up with others. And I'm sure the World Bank and UN can come up with other creative ways to get money quickly to the people who need it. Right. But it doesn't mean that the money goes to the government. It means that the money goes to the...
That's a very good point. Farhadi Saab, I'll have to actually go back to Farhadi Saab. Farhadi Saab, while we are suggesting all these elements of possibilities, we are, of course, we'll have to look at the precedents which might be there, whether there are any, or we are going to actually build a system from ground up. But my concern is that whatever solution we are talking about, they start day after tomorrow. And we are talking about people who are suffering right now at this very moment. So money is one thing that people might have or they can withhold. But one more important entity that people think they have but they don't is time. How do you reconcile the two?
Unfortunately, time is not really something that Taliban are sensitive about. They are still in this era of celebrating some sort of a victory, because I read very closely their tweets, etc. They say we are finally independent, we make our own decisions, but at the same time, they also call for the international community to help. So there's a lot of dichotomy in what they are saying. We are trying to help them basically to give them ideas and say, look, if you let's play wise, and to collect our money, we have to make some changes in Kabul.
Right, but Farhadi Saab, through you, let me ask all the audience to place themselves in the shoes of a 12-year, 13-year-old girl who realizes that the world is actually sanctioning Taliban for her rights, but who is actually at this moment dying of hunger or because of cold. So what are you going to tell her? She didn't bring the Taliban into power. Should she wait until the world actually reconciles all these facts and it actually sorts everything out?
And Farrukh, actually, it's not just the Taliban regime who are perhaps not giving attention to time. It's also the international community. Yeah, no one's really looking at the matter very urgently.
Farhadi Saab.
That's correct. That's correct. In fact, the people have been without a voice for what has been going on in Afghanistan, unfortunately, for some time. And the young girls, the urban ones, I read also their tweets, they're completely in despair, because a young girl has ambitions to finish school, to go to work, to make a living, to help her family, others. And this prospect has been arrested, I would say, with what's happening for them. And the ones who are under the tents and the refugees and take care of 4 other little brothers and sisters don't even realize what's going on. It's very
Right,
sad.
of course.
Sana,
Yes,
I tell you, being father of 2 girls, I will go to the hell and back for the right of that young girl to
sure,
educate
of
herself.
course.
But let me remind everybody that the dream of learning comes after dream of feeding oneself, right? Education might be a dream, but let us hope that basic amenities and food and sustenance doesn't become a dream in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. And Farrukh, I also want to talk about Pakistan's stance in this regard. Madiha, we know that Pakistan, of course, has been making huge efforts with regards to peace in Afghanistan, even before the Taliban regime came into power. Yet, despite that, it seems that Pakistan's position may still not be as clear to the international community at large and to all the countries who are looking at the situation in Afghanistan and what Pakistan is doing in this regard. This, of course, is a big step that is hosting the OIC Foreign Ministers meeting tomorrow, and it has made it very clear that they're not spokespersons for the Taliban regime and in fact are facilitators for peace. But do you think that this stance is something that is shared by everyone in the international community? Are they all understanding or looking at Pakistan in the same way that we are as a peace facilitator, or are there still questions about Pakistan's role?
I think in the US, there are still questions about Pakistan's role, and the congressional hearings that I've referred to a number of times in this call have made that clear. I think, they basically want to review Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban over the last 20 years and what role that played in the defeat of the United States in Afghanistan. So in the US, there's certainly questions. I think the international community, in particular the EU and other countries are more on Pakistan's page, if you will, in terms of Pakistan's stance. But even the US, the fact that again, Tom West is in Islamabad after attending the Troika Plus meeting in November, back again in December to attend this, is an important signal that the US is listening to Pakistan. And I think this meeting and how it goes tomorrow might help Pakistan in terms of how the world looks at it.
Dr. Madiha, while talking about mistrust, and of course trust deficit is something which has been, Pak-US relations, it's been seeing for a long time. Of course, we were getting the slogans from the Americans in terms of, asking Pakistan to do more in the past as well. But now, question here is there someone in the American cabinet right now who considers that Pakistan is the same country who actually lost 80,000 people in this war on terror, and more than $220 billion of its economy Pakistan has lost? Is there anyone who actually considers these facts as well?
I mean, I think, the president, frankly, obviously lived through as vice president that time when Pakistan was dealing with the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan insurgency. So, he understands, and his, various, the Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor were all with him at that point in time as well. So they were all part of the Obama administration, and that was exactly the time that Pakistan was dealing with its insurgency. They understand. However, I think, still there's the question in the US on the flip side, right, about Pakistan's relationship with the Afghan Taliban. And so that is the fundamental tension here. But that being said, I think, one should look at Tom West being in Islamabad today as a signal that America is listening, and I think that's where I would leave it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Madiha, for those comments. Mr. Farhadi, I'll take your last comment since we're almost out of time.
Just that with the Ukraine crisis, for Europe and for America, Afghanistan might become a simmering crisis and forgotten.
Right. That's important.
And of course, we really hope that is not the case. But thank you very much, Mr. Farhadi and Ms. Madiha, for joining us and being part of the show and this very important discussion on Afghanistan. Of course, there are so many things that we expect from the OIC Foreign Ministers meeting tomorrow. And whatever the situation may seem, we really hope for some positive change. Farrukh, you wanted to say something in the end, as always?
Right, not as always, because you are the one who has the last word. But regarding Afghanistan, I just wanted to say a couple of things which are very important. One, that whosoever is thinking about Afghanistan right now, they should be talking about the needs of the people right now, because people can be dying at this moment, right? And for that to happen, tomorrow, when the meeting takes place, of course, you will be looking forward to statements coming out, but I will also be looking at pledges. And the second thing is, if I were an Afghan, because India and Pakistan rivalry also plays into it, someday I would have actually, if I was an Afghan, I would have locked up Indian and Pakistani leadership in one room and would have asked them to develop consensus on Afghanistan.
Faisal,
Because otherwise they keep on upping each other.
Faisal, you want to add something quickly?
I have very high hopes from this OIC summit, and I just want them hopes to come realized.
Absolutely, and this, of course, is the real dream for every Pakistani and for every Afghan citizen. We want real help and real change in Afghanistan. This is a big step that's happening tomorrow. Whatever the complications may seem, let this be said and be noted that this is a very important and significant event that is taking place in Pakistan tomorrow. This is an extraordinary session of the OIC Foreign Ministers meeting, and a lot can actually come out of it, and that is the real hope that we hope that it actually does. We will be here throughout PTV World doing special transmissions on whatever's going on in the OIC Foreign Ministers Conference tomorrow. So stay tuned to PTV World for the updates, and then of course a special discussion on the debate at 8 p.m. tomorrow. Stay tuned. Thank you for watching.